Everyone laughed when an elderly couple spent their last $12 on a collapsed coal depot that nobody wanted. But hidden beneath decades of coal dust was a secret that would rewrite the town's history, uncover forgotten heroes, and leave the people who mocked them speechless. Before we begin this incredible story, make sure you're part of our YouTube family by hitting the subscribe button. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, settle in, because this story starts with a forgotten coal depot bought for just 12 and ends with a discovery that changed an entire town's history forever. Let's get into it. The first snow of November settled quietly over Ash Creek, covering broken rooftops, rusted railway tracks, and abandoned storefronts, with a blanket of white that almost made the forgotten mining town look alive again. Harold Whitmore stood outside, the small house he had built with his own hands nearly 50 years earlier. His thick gray coat barely kept out the cold as he looked toward the empty hillside where smoke once poured from the coal mines day and night. "They're finally gone," he whispered. Margaret stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "The last train left yesterday." Harold nodded slowly. For most people, it was just another piece of news. For him, it felt like the closing chapter of an entire lifetime. Ash Creek had once been filled with life. Children rode bicycles through crowded streets. Coal trucks lined the roads before sunrise. The bakery opened at 5 every morning. Neighbors never locked their doors. Every Saturday night, families gathered in the town square while musicians played beneath strings of glowing lights. Now, most windows were boarded shut. Weeds pushed through cracked sidewalks. The old train station echoed with silence. Only a few hundred people remained. Many urged Harold and Margaret to leave. "Come live with us," their daughter Sarah begged every Christmas. "You shouldn't stay in a ghost town." Margaret smiled every time. "This is still home," Harold agreed. Every fence post, every oak tree, every brick carried a memory. He wasn't ready to abandon them. Money had become tight after the mine closed. Harold survived by repairing old farm equipment. Margaret baked pies for neighbors whenever they could afford the ingredients. Neither complained. After 48 years together, they had learned that happiness depended less on money than on purpose. One chilly Monday morning, Harold unfolded the local newspaper. A tiny notice near the bottom of the page caught his attention. What public auction? Abandoned municipal properties. Among the listed buildings, old warehouses, a vacant rail office, several storage sheds, and one entry that made Harold stop reading. Former Blackstone Coal Depot. Margaret looked over his shoulder. "That place is still standing?" "Barely." Everyone in town knew the depot. It sat at the far end of the abandoned railway yard. Years earlier, part of its roof had collapsed during a severe storm. Since then, vines had swallowed its brick walls. Teenagers dared one another to sneak inside. Older residents warned them away. People claimed it was dangerous. Some even believed it was haunted by miners who never came home. Harold had never believed those stories. As a young mechanic, he often repaired equipment near the depot. Something about the place always fascinated him. Not because of what it was, because of what it had once meant. Every piece of coal leaving Ash Creek passed through that building. It had fed thousands of families. Now nobody wanted it. Margaret noticed the thoughtful look on his face. "You aren't thinking about buying it." Harold smiled. "For $12? She laughed. "You always bring home strange projects. Remember the old tractor everyone called junk? It still runs. The broken sawmill? It became our woodshed." Margaret shook her head, smiling. "I married a man who sees possibilities where everyone else sees problems." Harold folded the newspaper. "Maybe that's why you married me." The auction took place 3 days later inside the nearly empty town hall. Only a handful of people attended. Most came hoping to purchase inexpensive storage buildings. The coal depot appeared near the end of the list. The auctioneer barely looked interested. Former Blackstone Coal Depot. Opening bid. Silence. "Anyone interested?" No hands rose. The auctioneer sighed. "Minimum bid, $12. The room remained quiet. Someone laughed softly. A man near the back whispered, "They'll have to pay someone to haul those bricks away." Another replied, "The roof's gone. The foundation probably isn't much better." Harold slowly raised his hand. 12. The room burst into quiet laughter. Even the auctioneer smiled. "Mr. Whitmore, you really want the depot?" Harold nodded. "If nobody else does?" The auctioneer looked around one final time. "Any higher bids?" Nothing. The gavel struck. Sold for $12. As Harold signed the paperwork, several neighbors shook their heads. Old Frank Miller chuckled. "Harold, you finally bought yourself a pile of rocks." Margaret simply smiled. She had heard people laugh at Harold before. Years later, they usually stopped laughing. The following morning, the couple drove to the depot in Harold's aging pickup truck. The road leading there hadn't been used in years. Tall weeds brushed against the tires. Rusted railroad tracks disappeared beneath thick grass. The depot stood exactly where Harold remembered, only older. The western wall leaned slightly. Broken windows stared like empty eyes. Half the roof had collapsed inward decades earlier. Nature had slowly reclaimed everything. Harold unlocked the heavy chain wrapped around the entrance. The old doors groaned open. Dust floated through bright winter sunlight streaming from the missing roof. Inside, time had stopped. Coal carts still rested beside rusted rails. Broken lanterns hung from cracked beams. Old wooden crates lay scattered across the floor. Everything smelled of stone, iron, and history. Margaret walked carefully beside her husband. "You really think this place can be saved?" Harold smiled. "I don't know, but I think it deserves someone who'll try." They spent the morning clearing fallen branches from the entrance. By afternoon, they had filled several truckloads with broken timber. Neither noticed how many neighbors slowed their cars to watch. Most shook their heads. Others laughed openly. "They're too old for this. That building will collapse before spring." Harold ignored every comment. Late in the afternoon, while sweeping coal dust from a corner of the depot, Margaret's broom struck something unusually solid beneath the dirt. Not wood, not brick. Stone. She knelt and brushed away years of black dust. A flat stone slab slowly appeared. It didn't resemble the depot's foundation. Its surface was smoother, older. Someone had carved strange symbols into it. Perfectly straight lines, circles, small geometric markings unlike anything used by the mining company. Margaret frowned. "Harold," he walked over. "What is it?" She pointed silently. Harold crouched beside her. He ran his gloved fingers across one of the carvings. It wasn't damaged. The lines remained sharp despite decades beneath coal dust. "That's strange." He looked around the depot. None of the surrounding walls contained matching symbols. Only this single stone. Margaret carefully brushed away more dirt. The slab grew larger, much larger. It wasn't just one stone. It appeared to be the top of something buried beneath the depot floor. Harold leaned closer. Then he noticed something that made him stop breathing for a moment. At the very center of the carved slab was a heavy iron ring. Fresh scrape marks surrounded it, as if someone had tried to pull it open not very long ago. Harold stared at the iron ring without saying a word. The fresh scrape marks around it didn't belong. Everything else inside the abandoned depot had been buried beneath decades of dust, rust, and silence. Yet the metal around the ring looked recently disturbed, as though someone had tried to lift it only weeks before. Margaret slowly looked around the empty building. "We're not the first people to find this." Harold nodded. "But whoever came here..." "You didn't finish." He reached for the iron ring. It barely moved. Years of dirt and corrosion had locked the stone hatch tightly in place. "I'll need better tools." The next morning, they returned carrying crowbars, shovels, lanterns, and a portable winch borrowed from Harold's old workshop. As they worked, several townspeople gathered outside the broken entrance. Frank Miller laughed loudly. "Find any gold yet?" Someone else joked. "Maybe the ghosts are paying rent." Harold simply smiled and kept working. He had learned long ago that arguing with people who laughed accomplished nothing. Results spoke louder. Hour after hour, they cleared dirt from the edges of the stone slab. Little by little, the outline became visible. It wasn't a foundation stone. It was a perfectly fitted hatch nearly 8 feet across. The strange carvings covered every inch of its surface. Margaret carefully traced one symbol with her finger. "I've never seen markings like these." Neither had Harold. By late afternoon, the hatch finally shifted. A deep grinding sound echoed through the empty depot. Cold air rushed upward from beneath the floor. It carried a smell unlike coal. Cool. Dry, ancient. Harold lifted his lantern and peered into the darkness. Stone steps disappeared underground. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Margaret smiled. "Well, you always wanted another project." Harold laughed. "I didn't expect one underground." The following morning, they contacted the Ash Creek Historical Society. Only one volunteer answered, Professor Eleanor Hayes. She had spent 30 years studying the town's history, although few people cared enough to listen anymore. When she saw photographs of the carvings, her expression changed instantly. "Where did you find these?" "The old coal depot." She became unusually quiet. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Inside the depot, she examined every carving carefully. Then she removed a worn notebook from her bag. To Harold's surprise, several drawings inside matched the symbols almost perfectly. "I've seen these before," she whispered, "but only in very old settlement journals." Margaret frowned. "The coal company built this depot." Professor Hayes slowly shook her head. "No, the depot was built on top of something much older." Harold looked toward the open hatch. "You mean..." She nodded. "I think that tunnel existed long before coal was ever discovered here." The three of them carefully descended the stone staircase. Each step had been cut by hand. The walls were built from massive stone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision. No timber supports, no mining equipment, no blast marks. This wasn't a mine. It was something else entirely. The passage stretched farther than their lanterns could illuminate. After nearly 200 feet, they reached a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron straps. Remarkably, it still stood. Harold pushed gently. The hinges groaned. The door slowly opened. Beyond it lay a hidden chamber untouched for generations. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Old lanterns rested beside handmade tools. Blankets remained neatly folded inside weathered chests. Clay water jugs still stood in neat rows. Professor Hayes covered her mouth. "This isn't storage." Margaret looked around carefully. "It feels like people lived here." Professor Hayes nodded. "I believe they did." Harold noticed several leather-bound journals resting inside a wooden cabinet protected from moisture. He carefully lifted one. The pages remained surprisingly well preserved. Across the front, someone had written a date: October 1872, nearly 20 years before the first official records claimed. Ash Creek had been founded. Professor Hayes immediately understood what that meant. If these journals are authentic, everything we know about this town may be wrong. Word spread faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, reporters arrived. Television crews parked outside the depot. State archaeologists requested permission to inspect the tunnel. The same neighbors who had laughed now waited eagerly behind safety barriers, hoping for another discovery. Frank Miller approached Harold awkwardly. "I guess I owe you an apology." Harold smiled kindly. "No need." Frank looked embarrassed. "I shouldn't have laughed." Harold simply patted him on the shoulder. "We've all judged something too quickly." Excavation continued for another week. Hidden chambers appeared one after another. Old maps, medical supplies, children's toys, family photographs, boxes filled with handwritten letters. Every discovery painted the picture of a forgotten community living beneath the ground during some terrible crisis. Then Margaret uncovered something unexpected. Behind a loose stone rested a small iron chest sealed with thick wax. Unlike everything else, it carried no dust. Almost as if someone had intentionally protected it. Professor Hayes carefully broke the brittle seal. Inside lay a single envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. Across its front were 7 handwritten words that made everyone in the chamber fall completely silent. To the founder of Ash Creek, open only when the truth is needed. The underground chamber fell completely silent. Harold carefully lifted the sealed envelope from the iron chest, holding it as though it might crumble in his hands. Even after all those years, the faded blue ribbon remained tied in a perfect knot. Professor Eleanor Hayes adjusted her glasses, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this letter is authentic, it could change everything." Margaret looked at Harold. "It belongs to the town." Harold nodded. "It should be opened where everyone can witness it." The following afternoon, the Ash Creek Town Hall was filled for the first time in decades. Every seat was occupied. People stood along the walls. Television cameras lined the back of the room. Children sat beside elderly former miners. Even people who had moved away years earlier had returned after hearing about the discovery beneath. The old coal depot. The mayor stepped forward. "Today isn't just about an old building. It's about our history." Professor Hayes carefully untied the ribbon. She unfolded the fragile letter and began reading aloud. "My name is Elias Turner. If this letter reaches future generations, then the truth has finally found its way to the light." The room became completely still. The official records will never tell you how Ash Creek truly survived its first winter. The men who claimed credit were not the ones who saved this town. They arrived after the danger had passed. Murmurs spread across the audience. Professor Hayes continued. "It was the miners, their wives, immigrant families, blacksmiths, teachers, and children who built these underground shelters with their own hands. When blizzards buried our homes and food ran out, these tunnels became our refuge. We shared every loaf of bread, every blanket, every candle. No family was turned away." Harold noticed tears forming in Margaret's eyes. The letter continued. "When prosperity finally came, powerful businessmen rewrote the records. They placed their own names in history books, while those who sacrificed, everything disappeared from memory. I leave behind these journals so future generations will know the truth." Silence filled the hall. Many people were crying openly. Professor Hayes slowly lowered the letter. "For over 100 years, our town honored the wrong founders. No one spoke. They couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming. Over the following weeks, historians verified every journal, map, and document recovered from the hidden chambers. The dates matched. The names matched. Old census records confirmed the forgotten families had truly existed. Everything in the letter was real. Ash Creek's history had been rewritten generations earlier. Now it would finally be corrected. News spread across the country. Newspapers called it one of the most remarkable historical discoveries in the state's history. Universities offered Harold and Margaret large sums for the artifacts. Private collectors made even bigger offers. One businessman quietly offered $500,000 for the original journals. Harold smiled politely. "They're not for sale." The businessman looked shocked. "You could live comfortably for the rest of your lives," Margaret answered gently. "So could the people who wrote those journals. They never got the chance. Instead, Harold and Margaret donated every artifact to the State Historical Museum under one condition. Every forgotten family whose name appeared in the journals would receive permanent recognition. The museum agreed immediately. Construction crews soon arrived at the abandoned depot. But this time, they weren't there to demolish it. Architects restored the old brick walls. The collapsed roof was rebuilt. Glass walkways allowed visitors to safely view the underground chambers exactly as they had been discovered. The forgotten coal depot became the Ash Creek Heritage Center. Tourists began arriving every weekend. Small businesses reopened. A cafe opened across the street. The old bakery fired up its ovens again. Children once again played in the town square. For the first time in years, Ash Creek felt alive. One bright spring morning, the mayor invited Harold and Margaret to the dedication ceremony. Nearly the entire town attended. A large bronze plaque stood beside the entrance. The mayor smiled. This building belongs to everyone, but none of us would be standing here without two people who refused to see a ruin where everyone else saw one. He pulled away the covering. The plaque read, "Dedicated to Harold and Margaret Whitmore, whose faith in forgotten places restored the true history of Ash Creek." The crowd rose to its feet. The applause lasted several minutes. Harold looked embarrassed. Margaret squeezed his hand. "You earned this." He quietly shook his head. "No, the people beneath this building earned it." Later that afternoon, a group of school children entered the restored tunnel on a history tour. One little boy stopped beside Harold. "Mister, were you scared when you opened the hatch?" Harold smiled. "A little." "Then why did you do it?" Harold looked toward the stone staircase disappearing underground. "Because sometimes the oldest doors are hiding the newest beginnings." The boy smiled before running to catch his class. As evening approached, Harold and Margaret sat together on a bench outside the restored depot. Families laughed nearby. Visitors admired the museum. Children pointed excitedly toward the old railway tracks. Margaret leaned gently against Harold's shoulder. "Remember when everyone laughed because we spent $12? Harold chuckled softly. "I do." "Worth it?" He looked at the building, glowing in the afternoon sunlight. The forgotten depot, the hidden tunnel, the families whose names had finally returned to history. The town that had found hope again. Then he smiled. It was never about the $12. It was about believing that even forgotten places deserve someone willing to look a little deeper. Margaret smiled. "And that's exactly what you did." Hand in hand, they watched visitors continue entering the depot that nobody had wanted. A place once dismissed as a worthless ruin had become the heart of an entire town again, proving that history's greatest treasures are often buried beneath the places everyone else has forgotten.